Gutwein Law is the law firm. We're a business law firm, so transactional work, this is what we do. Why to form an entity, some of your options when you're forming an entity and why you might choose one over the other. How to actually do it. Not that you should necessarily go out and do it by yourself, but it's really not that hard to create an entity. It's kind of all the organizational docs behind it that get more attention from the legal side. And then when to form an entity, which is something that's coming up for you guys. Clients, I guess are you guys familiar with Premier? Hopefully you are. They came through this spoiler contest. I think it was the first year they did the spoiler contest. They were in your shoes. I guess that's probably 5 years ago now. Startup started here. Now they're in Indianapolis. I think they have like 20 employees. It came out of the boiler contest. There's other examples of that in some of these clients. I don't know if you've heard of all of these. Senses, obviously, it's a Purdue affiliated egg company. Purdue Fed, obviously. Passageways is a Purdue founder. N25's investment group that we work with. Okay, so entity formation. Big picture, there's lots of different types of entities that you can choose to be. The thing to remember is even if you don't choose to be in a business, you can end up in one, which isn't always where you want to be. So if you just go out and start selling something, you have a business. It's called a sole proprietorship. If you're selling a product and it kills someone or it just goes haywire, you're on the hook for that yourself. That's one of the big reasons why you form an entity, to have this limited liability. General partnership is the same thing. If you just go out with your friend and start a business, you've actually created a general partnership. The word of, I guess, the advice there is if you do that, just understand that your friend can now bind you and have you personally liable in contracts for something they do. So those are kind of the default things that you set up without meaning to. Sometimes they work out fine, but a lot of times it's worth paying, $100 to form an entity, or $1,000 to hire an attorney to form an entity, and just avoid those two things. The most common things that get formed are limited liability company and corporations. Have you guys, what's your familiarity? Does anyone have a company formed, or, okay, we've got a couple companies. LLCs, corporations, what do you have? LLCs, okay. So LLCs are great. They're generally made for small businesses. They're kind of new in the world of entities. They've only been around about 20 years. They're really flexible, which is why they're great. You can kind of set them up however you want. From a tax perspective, they're a pass-through entity, meaning that the IRS kind of acts like they're not even there. It's just the individual owners pay taxes, which obviously has benefits compared to corporations, which you hear about having 2 layers of taxation and getting robbed twice, basically. Corporations tend to be what tech startups are. And there's different reasons for that, but it's about a lot of times having a structure that your investors are going to be familiar with. And if you need outside investment, you got to make them happy too. And also, that pass-through idea with LLCs is actually a problem for investors because it works both ways. You can pass through losses, which if your investors have a job on the side, you pass through loss. It's a good thing for them because it reduces their taxes. If you pass through income, you don't actually have to pay them anything. They get something called phantom income, and now they're paying out of their pocket without actually getting any cash from you. So it's hard to raise money as an LLC. It can be done. It's usually done in form of like a convertible note or a safe. But a lot of times you see LLCs converting to corporations when you start to raise money. And the good news about that is it's pretty painless, and you can go from an LLC to a corporation without major tax consequences. You can't really go from a corporation to an LLC without paying a lot of taxes out of pocket. S corporation, we can talk about it. It doesn't really apply much to tech startups. It's an election you can make to be treated in a certain way for tax purposes. You don't actually have to be a corporation to take that election. You could be an LLC. It's made more for, it's a small business election. It's really made for like small service-based businesses. There's some tax benefits to it, but it also, it limits who can be your owners. So you can only have up to 100 owners. Everyone has to be a US citizen or resident alien. So it's not really popular for investment because you start limiting who can invest. Other types of companies, so there's limited liability partnerships, benefit corporations are kind of a new thing, obviously nonprofits, series LLCs, those all kind of have like their niche markets. someone may be doing something with those applies here. LLC are kind of a neat thing. It's really made for real estate. But in general, you guys are talking about LLCs and corporations. That's where you're going to probably end up. Okay, so when you're talking about forming an entity, I mentioned earlier, you want to think about why you form, what you need to be thinking about, how they operate, what's the management structure, how do you make decisions, how do you raise money, and then trying to form the right one. There's all these choices trying to figure out which one's the best. And it changes. It's the thing to remember. Like at a certain point in time, an LLC may make sense for one company. The same company a year later, you may need to be a corporation. Any questions so far? Anything that you kind of want to go back to? Okay, so why form an entity? The big thing, like I mentioned, is limited liability protection. A really basic concept, but it's huge when you think about it. Like I said, forming an entity, the legal way to do it, just going to the state, paying a fee, and filing really simple articles with the state, it's like $100. And if you do it right, you can sell your product, as long as you're not being fraudulent, your entity's liable, not you. So your house, your car, your bank account, it's not gonna be on the hook for any of that stuff. Your entity is, so like the computer in the entity, its bank accounts, that type of stuff. It can end up being taken if everything crashes, but at least you get to keep your house, your car, and all that stuff. It's a really simple protection. Kind of thinking about another reason to form an entity, you're not going to raise money unless you have an entity. No one's going to hand you a check and say, yeah, go do your business, put it in your personal bank account, let's hope this works out. They want to put it into an entity that, that's what they're investing in. If something happens to you, your ideas are part of that entity, your IP, whatever you create, it's still there, and it can grow. Avoiding unintended consequences. This kind of goes back to that partnership idea. We've seen it happen where two people start a business, one of them goes off rogue and does something, and now the other one's on the hook for it. They didn't even know it was happening. It's hard to avoid, honestly. And if you set up an entity where you say, okay, this is your role, this is where you have authority, anything outside of that you don't have authority, you can really help avoid some of that stuff. Really goes back to if you have a business and it's you and your buddy, you start the founding group of the company, one leaves, that may have just wrecked your business if you didn't have an entity that held that IP that you can say this is where that stays, and you had a clean document saying, okay, I'm going to give my software to this company, stuff like that. Taxes, won't get into too much, but you can actually save money on taxes by forming an entity just because of how you can run some expenses through companies and things like that. Okay, so high level things that we think about when forming an entity. How are we going to own this? So, if you have employees, founders, and investors, you may have a couple or even 3 different classes of stock. Some may have voting rights, some may get preferred dividends, or they get their money back first before everyone else. So when you're forming an entity, knowing what you can do, like with an LLC, it's really flexible. So LLCs are good for like venture capital funds, because you can say, okay, I'm going to let the money flow this way. You get your money first, and then after that, you get 20% of everything, but we're going to give 80% to these people. It's really flexible. Corporations aren't that flexible. Everyone in the same class, when you pay a dividend to that class of stock, they all have to get the same dividend. So you kind of have to create all these classes and be a little more rigid. Operational structure. So again, LLC is really flexible. You can have just a manager run the show, and that's it. Corporations, it's kind of rigid. You have a board of directors. They appoint officers, and the officers run the day-to-day. They hire people. Board of directors make long-term decisions, and the shareholders, the owners, are the ones that put the board of directors in place. So the ownership kind of indirectly runs the company. In reality, when you start a company, you're going to be the shareholder, the director, and the CEO, whatever it is. Tax issues, mentioned that, industry practice. The best example of this is if you ever want to start a venture capital fund, you're going to start a limited partnership. There's really no reason to do it anymore. LLCs are probably better structured for it. But if you go to the coast to try to raise money and you're not a Delaware LLP, no one's going to put money in your company. So some things like that exist just because people are used to it. They know what they're getting into. Client preferences. It's literally a thing where sometimes clients just want to be a corporation because they think that sounds cooler. Sometimes there's no harm, no foul set up a corporation. through just so you guys have a background. Have you guys taken business law or anything like that? You have? Okay. Some of this is kind of that level of discussion. So corporations, the ownership, it's shareholders, it's the people that own the company. You can have one class, multiple classes, so you can have different voting rights, different preferences for economic rights. Government, so to create a corporation, you file what's called articles of incorporation with the state. Literally, that's all you have to do, pay a fee, and you have a company. Everything else that comes after that's what your attorneys are going to tell you to do, but technically, if you file the articles, you have a company, it's a real thing. Bylaws are kind of like the playbook of a company. It tells you how you're going to hold meetings, how you're going to elect officers, how you're going to make major decisions. So it's just kind of your instruction manual. And then management, you have a board of directors that's elected by the shareholders. Those are the kind of guys that do set long-term goals, and they appoint the day-to-day officers and kind of run it at a high level. Another reason why tech companies and corporations, investors can put someone on the board, have a little bit of contact, a little bit of control, but not have to be there daily running everything. And then the issue that you hear about in corporations, it is subject to double taxation. It's not as bad as it sounds because of how tax rates actually work. But corporations are their own entity, meaning when it makes money, it's got to pay the IRS cut of that. And then what's left just sits there, and once it pays the owners through the dividend, the owners pay income taxes on that again, so it gets hit twice. Like I said, in reality, it's not as much as you think because there's exceptions and there's carve-outs. Let's see, that's corporations. So the other major setup is going to be a limited liability company. Ownership is called members, so you have shareholders in a corporation, members in a limited liability company. You can have however many you want. Something to keep in mind, if you ever cross the threshold of 2,000, you just became a public company. It's not a great idea if you don't mean to. It's really expensive. You can have multiple classes. Like I said, it's really flexible. Whatever you decide you want to do from the management side, from a dividend or a payout side, you can do it with an LLC. You may not want to because once it gets so complicated, you may not be able to follow it yourself, but you can do it. Governance, again, you file articles with the state that creates the entity, and then kind of parallel the bylaws is the operating agreement. The operating agreement, it's the same thing. It talks about management, ownership, ownership, how major decisions are made. But because LLCs are so flexible, it's like 4 times as big as bylaws during them because you have to cover more to say this is what we're going to do. Whereas bylaws, there's more statute and case law behind it, where if you get into a situation, this is what you're supposed to do. Management, so you can either be member managed or manager managed, just kind of something to note. If you're an LLC, I know a few of you said you are. Do you guys know if you're member managed or manager managed? Okay, it's a check the box. Some people don't pay attention to that. Generally, unless there's a specific reason not to be, you want to be manager managed. If you're member managed, what that means is anytime someone comes in as an owner, they have authority to go out and sign a contract for you and you're bound to it. It just means like it's made for companies where all the members or all the owners are actually active in it. Manager managed means you appoint someone, say you're going to run the show, and then everyone else is just an owner. And you can have multiple managers, that's kind of what that's getting on, general manager. When we set up tech companies as LLCs, what we actually do is mirror the corporation. So you have a board of managers, which is literally the same as the board of directors. Like you give them the same authority. They appoint officers. The benefit is if you're a tech company and you end up switching to a corporation, you just kind of move everything over. It's a seamless transition. You don't have to rearrange everything. Taxes, again, on LLCs, the IRS just ignores that it exists. So if you make money, it's going to pass through to your personal taxes. You're going to pay taxes on your percentage. So if you're a 50% owner, you pay taxes on 50%. If you're a 50% owner and you lose money, you get to take that 50% loss, which is a good thing, again, if you're making money. Okay. So high level statutes kind of make up the background. So like I said, you can go and form a company just by filing articles and paying a $100 fee. If you don't have those bylaws or those operating agreements in place, there's pages and pages of statute that says this is how your company's run. And a lot of times it's not what you intend to be. So it's usually a good idea to pay or just go out and find an operating agreement that works for your situation. You generally don't want to rely on statute because it might put you in a situation that you don't intend to be in. Fiduciary obligations. One thing to keep in mind when you own a company, especially when you are a director or an officer of that company, so like a startup where you start raising money, you owe fiduciary obligations to your other owners and the company itself. So that means you can't compete with that company. That would be an issue and you can get sued for it. That's generally the biggest thing. Even then other things are like trying to use, we'll call it trade secrets, or like ideas that are supposed to be the company. You're trying to start a company outside of it. You can't do that type of stuff. Once you form a company, that's its own thing and it has certain protections. And then that level of protection gets stepped up again if you have outside investors, because basically now you have other people that have interest in it too, and you really have to pay attention.
Set up by LLCs as well?
Yeah, good question. It does, and actually, that's kind of came out of case law, and a lot of places weren't clear. Indiana actually takes it a step further. Indiana says, in general, you only owe fiduciary duties as an officer, so it's like you're a high-level employee, so you got to do the best thing for the company. Or as a director, same thing, you run the company, so you got to do the best thing for the company. Indiana goes further and says if you have a company with, it doesn't name the number, we'll say 15 or less shareholders or owners, you owe fiduciary obligations to your other shareholders or owners. And the thought there, whether it's right or not, is that you're basically a partnership at that stage, so you should deal, they say, fairly openly and honestly. Basically, you have to be transparent with all your other owners. Other states don't have that, and in Indiana, you can actually waive it if you put it in your operating agreement, which is the reason to have an operating agreement. It sounds like you're trying to be shady, but sometimes when you think about it, as an owner, you may not have the same interests as another owner, especially if you're a majority owner and they're a minority owner or something like that. Any other questions on this stuff? Okay, so LLCs versus corporations. Again, corporations have two levels of taxes. You can take that selection. It really probably won't apply to you unless you're a service company, like providing professional services. LLCs have one layer of taxes, the phantom income tax, like I mentioned earlier. It's an issue if you try to raise money generally. Profit distributions, corporations have to pay profits pro rata to the ownership. You can have different classes, so you can say we're just paying a dividend to our preferred stock, but everyone in that class has to get the same dividend. LLCs is just literally whatever you guys put on paper and agree to, that's how you pay out profit. Operations, like I said earlier, corporations are more rigid. You have a board, you have officers. LLCs, again, it's however you agree to do it. Yeah, so I think I probably covered all this, but corporations, specifically C corporations, tend to be venture-backed companies. That's where they get used the most. Investors like it because they know what they're getting into. If a decision has to be made, they know what has to happen. A board meeting has to occur, the board has to approve it. If it's X, Y, or Z, the shareholders have to approve it. They know the process, and it's pretty much the same across companies. LLCs, you don't have that, so that's a concern, obviously, for investors. There's no phantom income because you only pay taxes when you get a dividend, so investors don't worry about paying their own money out. There's some tax benefits that, it helps to know about this stuff. It's further beyond, it's kind of where you're in the growth stage. One thing to know about this is qualified small business stock. You can only get it if you're a corporation, and you can't be a service industry business, so you have to be like a tech company or someone that's providing a product. And I'm pretty sure, I meant to look this before I came, but I think SaaS type product counts, so that they don't consider that service. It basically means if you hold on to your stock in that company for 5 years, which as a founder you're going to probably do, your company's probably not going to sell in 5 years, you get 100% of your gain excluded from, or taxed at, no, it's 100% excluded from income tax. So you don't have to pay taxes on your gain, which as a founder you're probably not putting much money in anyways, which means you're basically getting, I think it caps at maybe 50 million, but it's a lot of money without paying taxes. So you can only get it as a corporation. If you're an LLC and you switch to a corporation, you can still get it if your timing, as I understand it, starts from where you switch, so you have a long holding period. Yeah.
So then if you make over that, do you pay taxes on it?
No, it doesn't go back. Yeah, no, they're not that bad. But yeah, I mean that's a lot of money, obviously. But it's one of those little perks of just knowing it exists. And I've seen companies where they actually will delay. It's more complicated because you can actually get a larger amount depending on what your value is when the stock's issued. So it's not necessarily capped at 50 million. I could be making that number up, but I think it's 50 million. But it's the greater of that, or I believe 10 times of the value when you take the equity. So if you start an LLC, you get it up to 10 million, and then you convert, you get 100 million excluded. You're kind of playing a risky game there, though, because if you sell within the next 3 years, you get nothing. S corps again, let's get that as one. LLCs, usually these are small ownership businesses. I have an LLC for a coffee shop that I used to own. It's flexible, it's really easy to get in and out of. Like, if you put anything into it, you can take it back out without having to pay taxes on it. That's not true with your corporation. Once you put something in a corporation, that corporation owns it. If you take it out, you just got income. So it's flexible that way. Okay, so forming an entity, like I mentioned, you can kind of accidentally form a sole proprietorship or general partnership. If you're a single person doing business, then you have a sole proprietorship. If you're 2 or more people, then you have a general partnership. Just know what you're getting into. I'm a lawyer, but I could pay $100 and form an entity. That liability, it's like a $100 insurance policy, basically. It makes sense. So if you form an entity with the state, whether it's an LLC, a corporation, or any of those other entities, you have liability protection. So if something goes wrong, the company's liable, you're not liable. There's exceptions to that, so you can't go out and defraud a bunch of people and then say I'm not liable for it. They can actually get around that. That slide. So creating an entity, like I mentioned, it's literally going on Secretary of State's website. You file articles. Most Secretary of State websites will have a form of articles that you can basically just say, I'm going to use your generic form. They don't include some things that are important about limiting your liability, but they work. Most states are $100, and yeah.
What's the process for transferring from one state to another?
So it depends. Actually, that brings up a good point. Does everyone understand that you can form an entity in any state? So you can have an Indiana LLC, a Delaware LLC, a California LLC. They're all similar. Delaware tends to be a favorite for different reasons. It's fairly protective. Indiana is close to Delaware in terms of its protections. So the question is, we'll say you form an Indiana corporation, because this happens quite often. You go to raise money and your investor says, yeah, that's great. I want you to be a Delaware corporation because that's what I'm used to. I know how they work. And I like X, Y, or Z about that. So how do you get your Indiana corporation to become a Delaware corporation? It's actually different basically every time depending on the 2 states involved, because each state, one state, it's called domestication, and both states have to allow you to convert. So if both states say, yeah, you can domesticate a foreign, they're called foreign companies, and so both statutes allow it. Usually it's a form filing, so pay a fee, file a form, and it just kind of happens automatically. So overnight, you go from being an Indiana corporation to a Delaware corporation. The old-fashioned way to do it is just to form a Delaware corporation and transfer all your assets over. You end up with the same result. It's just more expensive because there's more paperwork involved. Yeah.
So if your business is here in Indiana, do you still want Delaware one?
Yeah, good question. Yes. So it's more expensive because what's going to happen is where you create your company, they're going to have fees to create it there. Delaware is, what are they for a corporation? I think it comes out to about $600 for a corporation in Delaware. What you'll have to do is pay the state to have a company, pay a third party to be a PO box in that state for your company, so you have to have a physical presence, so it's like $150 a year. And then you'll pay a filing fee every year with that state to say, hey, here's my officers. Delaware has a franchise tax on top of that, so you pay all these fees to Delaware, but every state that you actually have a physical presence in, or what's called doing business, which is a weird gray area, but basically if you're physically there, or you have an office, you're doing business in that state, then you have to register in that state also. So if you form a Delaware entity, you're going to have fees there, and then, for instance, Indiana, you'll have a $100 fee every year too. So it just kind of duplicates the fees. We usually recommend that you form the company where you're physically located. You guys create kind of a problem with that when you're students and you're not here, and you could go back to where you're from if it's another state. Sometimes there's a discussion, well, you should just form in that state, and then, you know, how do you get to the point where you know where you're gonna be in 4 years? Any other questions? Yeah.
So do you pay taxes in both states if you wish to all states?
Yeah, so franchise tax is a way for Delaware to make money. It's not really a tax, it's a fee. They just want to charge it. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but like 70% of public companies are Delaware companies. It's a really popular place to have your entity for different reasons. You pay income taxes based on where you make your money. So it doesn't matter where you form your company. If you make a lot of your money out in California, California's going to ask you for a check for your income taxes. So yeah, the franchise tax is kind of a misnomer. It's just a fee they charge. Any other questions? Yeah, so like I said, once you file, you have your entity, and then it's kind of the stuff that we get paid for that. So creating your bylaws, your operating agreement, kind of a checklist when you form your company. You should have bylaws or operating agreement because it's your instruction manual of how you're going to run the company. Most of you guys, I imagine, are tech companies have some sort of software or some sort of hardware design. You want to have IP assignments because you want to make sure your company owns something that everyone's coming up with. Again, you see it a lot with college-based startups because people tend to have a 4-year lifespan in this area and they go different ways. That can really wreck a company if it has any growth, because if you didn't move all your software over to the company and then an investor comes along and says, how do I know you own that? You better be able to show at least a piece of paper showing that someone said that you owned it. Share certificates aren't that important anymore. Are you guys familiar with like Carta? So there's online ownership. It's called the cap table is kind of your ownership of your company. There's companies now that do it all online, which makes it really easy. The old way is to have paper certificates, which are kind of like car titles. There's more to it, but basically you can transfer ownership by signing the back of it and handing it to someone. These online services, they usually are fairly inexpensive, like a couple $100s to start, and they give you your online ownership, and they do some other back-end things that are really handy. I think for, might be $1,000 bucks, which, I mean, it's not cheap, but they'll do a valuation of your company, which is really important if you have employees that you're trying to give equity to, because there's tax consequences, so you have to get a value of your company figured out. It's something to know about. It's a good service. Buy-sell agreement, talk about that more generally, I think. So something important for tech startups, how many of you have heard of vesting? Anyone else? Okay, this is a huge concept. I think I spent like 30 minutes talking to some professors and the founder about this, and something I was doing last week or 2 weeks ago. But if you start a company and you have, we'll just say 4 people, you have to think about what if 1 or 2 of them leave. That's what attorneys do. We kind of think of like the worst case scenario and tell you what you should do because of that. But it's because we see it happen, and then if you don't have a plan in place, it can wreck your company. Vesting is this idea that you give out the ownership on day 1 to your founders. And you do it with employees too, but we'll talk about founders. And then you have it where it's earned over time. So usually the standard is 4 years, and you have the ownership in the meantime. So you get to vote, if you sell the company, you can usually have it accelerate, so you're treated as if you owned it. But the key is if you leave the company within that time period, you don't get to walk away with your 25% or whatever it is of the company. Usually it's if you leave in the first year, you don't get any of it. If you leave after the first year, then 25% will vest 12th month anniversary. And then every month for the next 36 months, 1/48 vests. So after 4 years, you're fully vested. The whole idea is you're forming a company. It's going to take a while to form a product, commercialize it, get to something that actually has value. You need to make sure everyone's there, that you're giving a big chunk of your company to. The obvious downside, if you don't have something like that, you start a company with 1 or 2 people, one of those people leave, and they walk away with 50% of the ownership or 33% of the ownership or whatever it might be. It's really hard to come back from that. Both from an investor side, you're not going to get an investor until you clean that up. From an ownership of IP side, there's things you can try to do, but yeah, it just creates an expensive mess that's really easy to fix. Even if you just Google it, you can find vesting agreements and things like that. I'm going to get all tax nerdy for a second, but there's an issue where you do vesting that you really need to know about. It's called an 83B election. So the IRS only taxes you on your income when it thinks you've earned it. And if you issue yourself equity in your company, it's technically income unless you pay for it, which a lot of times you don't. When you vest it, the IRS is going to say, well, you don't own that until it's vested. So if you vest it over 4 years, you're going to get chunks of that a year and then every month after that. The IRS is going to expect you to pay taxes on that as it vests, which is probably fine for a lot of companies, but if you think about companies that have this like hockey stick growth chart, 2-3 years out, the company's worth millions of dollars and they're getting 5%, 10% of that vested. That's a big tax consequence that they're going to be expected to pay. And the IRS takes it kind of seriously. A lot of times it's in retrospect, so it's like it happens when you sell the company. They realize, oh, you didn't do this, you should pay taxes. And they come back to you and ask for all your taxes for the last 4 years plus penalties and interest. 83B election is this idea, you file it with the IRS. It's literally a one-page piece of paper. And you basically tell the IRS, hey, I know I don't have to pay taxes on this, but I want to anyways. Here's my taxes for all my equity. It's been invested over 4 years. You get to pay taxes at the current value, which a lot of times you can say it's $10. I just formed the company, there's no value, so here's your taxes, it's $2. In a successful company, it saves millions of dollars. So just something to know about. It's only created because you're investing, so it's like you're trying to fix a problem, but sometimes you create another problem. But just everyone should know, if you take equity in a company, you probably should be doing an 83B election. A few other things probably worth talking about. Foreign entity registrations I mentioned earlier, thanks to your question. If you're in other states, if you're physically there, if you have if you're constantly in another state because you have like a single client in that state, you probably need to register with that state. It's not expensive, but it's something you should do. DBA registration, so a lot of companies will form their company under one name, then operate under like an abbreviated name, or they might have a software product, they just call themselves that software product. You should technically file that with the state so that when you use that name, I don't usually see it happen, but the fear is that you're using a name that's not actually your company, so if you like sign a document under that name, it's not your company, which means it's you individually, which means you're liable for it. It's like a $25 filing. When to form a company, so in my opinion, earlier is better. Basically, like I said, it's a $100 insurance policy. Do it as soon as you can. Usually the things that we see that people come to us and say, okay, I need to form a company. It's investment triggered, so someone says they want to put money in, but they don't know what to put it into. Liability protection, so once you start selling a product, especially if it has any, if there's chemicals involved or any hardware, probably makes sense to do. Credibility, if you start doing pitches and stuff, it's instant credibility to say this is my company versus this is what I'm trying to do. Creation of IP, so if you're forming any sort of software or any IP whatsoever, you want to make sure, especially if you're doing it as a group, that that's owned by an entity and not just kind of out there. Any questions?
How do you make sure your software is owned by your company?
So the legal document called an IP assignment basically says you'd have your founders and your employees sign it, and basically everything you create in your role of the company owns. It's harder to do as a startup, especially when they're not like an actual employee, because it's kind of like when are they working for the company, when are they not. So the language has to be kind of precise about what you're talking about. Usually you say, the best way, in my opinion, to do it is to describe what the company's trying to do, and then say anything you create in that world belongs to the company.
If you're just one person designing it, you have to worry about that.
You don't normally until there's an investor, because then they don't care. You're separate from the company is the problem for an investor. But if you're just a single person with a company, no, it really doesn't matter. kind of related to that question, I thought this might be where you're going. Open source software, are you guys familiar with? I hope you are. Know what the license is that you're incorporating. I mean, there's copyleft is not a great thing when you're a startup. Have some sort of idea of what, if you have people working for you, know what they're building into your programs and what that's causing. There's licenses underneath it. Most of what's out there anymore is permissive, meaning, hey, incorporate this, just reference our license and say who owns it within your code base. There's others that say once you incorporate this, whatever you put it into, that's all out there in the open source world, and that's not a good thing from a tech company perspective. So these are the things that I see happen that I think when I see it, it kind of makes me a little sick to my stomach. It's kind of easy to fix. When you form a company, before you name it, Google the name. Same thing for your product. Before you name a product, Google the product. One, you want to make sure no one else out there is doing the same thing with the same name, which happens more than you think. Two, you want to make sure if you're coming up with what you think is a unique name, that it means what you think it means, and that it's not related to something that happened 5 years ago that you don't want to be related to or anything like that. So just Google the name. Bigger issues would be use a name that someone else is using in the same area, then you could be infringing a trademark and get a nice cease and desist letter that says stop doing that. If you're going to form a company, and then especially if you pay someone or start developing a brand, you can be out a lot of money if someone comes along and says, hey, you can't use that name. Not vesting founders equity, like I said, that's a big deal. Yeah. Yeah. So, is everyone kind of familiar with trademarks? What they are? So basically, it's a name that you use to identify a product or a service, but it's not always your company name. Sometimes it's your product name, so you got multiple trademarks. There's different protections available. Like if you just come up with a name and start using it, you have what's called common law trademark protection, meaning no one else can use that name kind of in your world where you actually physically operate. And you just get that by being the first to do it. There's also state law protection, which no one does. Technically, you can file for protection with the state, pay a small fee, and no one else can use it in the state. It's kind of useless in today's world. And then the highest level is with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, which is a trademark filing with the federal government. That's going to say if you're first to file, your name, and then you also say what you're doing. So there's like 45 classes, and you have to say this is kind of what I'm doing. No one else can do it after that in the same class. If someone happened to be doing it before, they kind of get to carve out their little regional area. Like I think there's a Dairy Queen in like Southern Illinois that's not at all a Dairy Queen, but they had the name first, so they get to keep it. So what will happen, you could be the guy that comes along later with the name. You think you're good, you name your software something like Google. Turns out the name's used. You're going to get a letter from Google at some point that's going to say, hey, stop using that. You used our goodwill, so pay us a royalty for the last X years of X%. And yeah, it's just an easy thing to avoid if you just Google it to start. Yeah.
So once you trademark it, no one could register that name in another state or LLC?
So the name of the company is different from a trademark. Generally, you can have, LLCs are only checked, when you form a company, it's only checked against what's active in that same state. So there's a chance I could go form Google Inc. as an Indiana company. It's a different issue if you start to use that name in business and like hold yourself out as people. That's what the trademark is. That's kind of what you're holding yourself out as. So like if you have a product, you call it something, then if you file with the federal government, no one else can do it after that.
So can you not trademark your business?
You could, as long as you're the first to do it.
Is that a good idea to do that, or?
So there's kind of a gray area. Usually you trademark when you start to put real money into it. So it's like $1,200 to trademark, so it's not incredibly expensive. So if you're putting $5,000 into a branding campaign, maybe trademark it. If you just start a company, it's probably not a priority because there's not much. You kind of look at it as how much recognition do I have in my brand name, and at a certain point, it becomes worth it to pay some money and start protecting it. But before then, it's kind of like, well, I'll just switch the name, keep moving. Yeah.
Is there any sort of
Sorry, what? Yeah, so if you use someone's trademark without permission, you're infringing. And they can try to get damages from you. So the whole idea when you use someone else's trademark, like if I came up here and said if I had a Facebook shirt on or something like that, you might assume that I work for Facebook. And it's kind of the fact that I'm trying to use their goodwill to bank my, for my own company or for myself. That's why they get to come after you for trademark infringement. It's where you're kind of blurring the line as well. Is this your product or is this Facebook's product? So they can basically, the general damages are they're going to get to take all your profits. So if you made any money, they're going to get it. And if you did it kind of maliciously or intentionally, they're going to get usually what's called treble damages. So it's like 3 times that. So it's kind of a big deal if you're doing it. Yeah.
Are you with trademark if you're not in the same industry as them?
Generally not. Well, so when you file, no, I'm going to say no. When you file a trademark with the USPTO, you actually claim certain classes. You can file as many classes as you want, but generally you only protect the class that you actually operate in. Any other questions? Another issue, the A3B election, like I said, that's a huge thing to understand as a startup. It's a really easy thing to do. A lot of times it's a free thing to do, and it saves a lot of money. Not talking about IP, I've hit on that a couple times now, anytime in open source issues. The real idea is know who owns what you're creating and make sure it's your company that owns it. And then a whole other discussion. If you're going to raise money, just understand that it's incredibly regulated at the federal and state level. And there's a lot of restrictions on what you can and can't do, who you should or should not sell the equity of your company to. There's state filings, there's federal filings. So just from a regulatory side, it's kind of complicated. But then from a documentation side, there's so many pitfalls when you're raising money. You see things happen unintentionally all the time, so it really helps to hire someone that's done it a few times to kind of know, how, not even when you should raise money, but how, because there's so many different ways to raise money and fund your company, and each one kind of has its own ups and downs. Is there anything in particular you guys? Yeah, go ahead.
Talking about fundraising, can you give examples of that? What's all
Asking someone to put money in your company for ownership, generally. Yeah. So, securities law in general, it covers anything you try to do if you're raising money for the benefit of your company from someone that's supposed to be passive. So if they're just putting money in and hoping they get a return, that's probably securities. Is there anything you guys are working on or any topic in particular you have questions about? Yeah.
How do co-founders generally decide how to split the equity when they first start? I've heard that's not a good idea to have an even 50-50 split.
Yeah, that's really hard to avoid where there's 2 of you. But the concern is that, well, what happens when you're deadlocked? Attorneys come up with really good things to do. Not really. There's like one clause that I've seen is, I think they call it like a Texas shootout or something. It's basically you both float numbers and say, I'll buy you out for this, and the other one says, I'll buy you out for this, and the higher number has to buy the other person out. Like, it's worst case scenarios. And some of the idea is, look, this is really bad, you don't want to do this, so just come to an agreement. But yeah, 50-50 is not a great idea. In reality, if there's 2 of you, it's really hard not to be a 50-50. It's hard to say how you divide up between founders. It's easier when you get down the road and you start hiring outside executive officers, developers, because there's kind of a pattern you can follow there. Founders, I mean, you kind of have to look at what you're putting in and then what you're expected to continue and put in. And then just understand that it can change over time. Like, you don't have to be stuck where you start if you both, I mean, it gets harder to change it, obviously, but you can have it, incentives issued later or something like that. There's no great formula for founders, but 50-50 can be a problem.
So what do you recommend doing if there's 2 founders?
Equal contributions, you're both doing about the same amount of work?
Yeah.
50-50. Talk to a lawyer about what you're going to do if that goes south. I mean, there's, like I said, there's deadlock provisions and stuff. The whole basis of the deadlock provisions is let's make it so no one wants to go through this, so the only way they'll do it is if it's really a big deal. Yeah.
So you talked about like small business policies and obviously like their position and some of those are internationals.
So that does get more difficult. It really depends on the situation. It depends on if you're planning on staying here. There's visas that you may be able to get to work for your company. Yeah, it's really specific to the situation for international students.
So, with independent contractors, they have to reach the $600 free, what? If you don't independently reach that $600 maximum, you have to collect their social security number when they sign up.
Good questions. CPA is probably going to give you a different answer than what I'll give you. But generally, no, I don't think you would need it. You're talking about filing a 1099, and the reason is it lets you take it as an expense. Technically, you can still take it as an expense. They're still supposed to claim it even if you don't give them that form. But you're not required to give it until you exceed 600.
Okay. And then, so if someone's like dropping off dry cleaning and I'm paying them back for like them paying the dry cleaner, does that amount count towards the
No, because that's reimbursement. You're not paying them that, they're just being paid you.
Okay, so reimbursement.
Yeah.
So I've always heard that like a founder's agreement is super, super important. You didn't mention it. Is that the same as like an operating agreement?
So,
different?
yeah, a founder's agreement's kind of, it could be a group of like 5 things.
Okay.
In an LLC, it's definitely an operating agreement. In a corporation, it's probably more tied to your vesting agreement. Really, the vesting agreement is going to be key for a founder's agreement.
Okay, so that's just like an overarching term that isn't specific. Okay, gotcha. Nice.
It's basically trying to say what happens when things go south in all these different ways. There's also, it's not really used in the tech world, but in like more traditional businesses, there's an agreement called a buy-sell agreement, which is kind of the same idea. And basically it lays out all these situations that say, if X, Y, or Z happens, we can force you to sell, or you can force us to buy from you, and then it sets out like pricing mechanisms and things like that. Tech companies don't really use that because, well, different reasons, but a lot of times that has to do with just hard to peg values versus like a building company. You can kind of take a multiple of their revenues or something and come up with the value every year. Yeah.
Would it be advisable, would you say it's worth it to form an entity before having any revenue, or do you think it would be okay to have revenue in a separate bank account or something, and then form an entity later if you see it's worth it?
Generally, I see companies formed before revenue. Pre-revenue companies is completely standard, especially in the tech world, because you tend to have a development phase where you need money because you're spending it, but you don't have a product that you can actually put out there and sell. So a lot of times you raise money earlier, either because you want to start dividing up ownership, and the easiest way to do that is to own a company, or because you're raising money and you need a company to do that.
So for apps that use like privacy services like tax location, or like Facebook can't allow users under 13.
Yeah.
Is there like a specific legal writing that you need, or is it sufficient to just have check this box to make sure you're over 13, even if they're not, like something like that?
So yeah, they call it underage. 13 is kind of a weird age to think of that, but it's a federal law. I think it's called CAFA or something. Children's, I can't think what the abbreviation is. But it basically says if you have a website that's geared towards minors, and 13 years is the age you're looking at, then you have to have all these disclaimers and can't do these certain things. So it kind of depends on like what you're doing, how far you have to take that. Most websites don't even mention that because it's not geared towards minors. And then California tends to have more protective laws, which technically don't apply unless you have users in California, but when you're a website or a tech company, just assume you're going to have users. Usually what you'll have, and you'll see this on every website you go to, you'll have a terms of use, which is more really about protecting your IP and limiting your liability. And then you'll have a privacy policy that says, this is the type of information, excuse me, that we'll collect, and this is what we'll do with it. And that privacy policy is kind of what you have to have when you're collecting information.
I just want to make sure that in Indiana, for the service, we don't tax it, right? So like the user does not pay tax on the service.
The user does that.
So like.
Yes, yeah. So sales tax.
Sales tax.
Yeah, sales tax is only on the product. So even kind of a trick if you have a client that is selling a product and a service. You want to make sure that most of the money is going towards the service, not the products, and the buyer doesn't pay taxes. Yeah, like all my friends that have weddings, make sure that you're paying your caterer to be a caterer and not for the food, for instance, things like that. Yeah.
Is it generally easier or harder to form a nonprofit versus say an LLC?
Equal, except, so to form a nonprofit, it's the same process. There's no owners technically in a nonprofit because it's kind of, they look at like it's owned by everyone. But there's an additional step that you don't necessarily have to do, but if you want to bring money in and have people able to write off their donations, you have to file with the federal government for an exemption. It's really not that hard. There's like 5 years ago they came out. Normally it's like a 15-page form you have to file, and I think like an $850 fee. 5 years ago they came out with I think it's called a 1023 is the form, and they came out with the 1023 Easy, which is like 2 pages. It's just saying yes or no to a bunch of things, and as long as you're expected to have less than, I think it's 50, it might be 10,000 of annual money running through it, you can use that form. So if it's a small nonprofit, it's really not that much harder.
Do you think it's viable to do it without legal help? Like do it yourself?
I mean, I'm an attorney, so that's a hard question for me. I could do it without legal help. Yeah, I mean, there's pitfalls, but I mean, you guys are probably smart. If you look at what you're doing and try to pay attention, you probably won't miss too much. There's just, in my opinion, it makes sense to hire an attorney for most of this stuff. Yeah.
For the operating agreement and say like the vesting agreement, those type of things, is there any, besides reviewing it, is there any like good place to find outlets?
Yeah, I'm going to have to plug some of my competitors now. So there's some law firms out west, Oric. It's one that puts out some form documents. They're generally pretty good. They're not made for Indiana entities. They're made for Delaware, California entities. They're kind of, all the stuff you're going to find out there, unfortunately, it's one of two things. It's a form document that probably isn't made for what you're trying to do, or someone put out their very tailored document that is no way related to what you're doing. And unless you've seen a bunch of them, you don't know what you're looking at. But Oric puts out what they would consider like a tech company based set of documents. You're probably only going to find stuff for corporations and LLCs. I wouldn't trust anything you find. It's just, you can tailor it so much. Any other questions? All right. Well, I'll hang around if anyone has any questions they want to ask me in private about what they're working on.
Do you want to talk about the entity formation package at Gutwein?
Oh yeah, so if you're interested, I'm pretty sure we're offering the winner of this whole thing a free entity formation. I hope we talked to someone about that. But we've done that every year, so talk to me about that.
Okay.
We offer a package, a flat rate package for entity formation. It's $1,200 plus the fee, so it's like $1,300. It's basically, we form your entity, we file the articles, we draft the operating bylaws, we do the IP assignments, the vesting agreements, we do the share certificates, and all the ownership stuff. It's basically everything you need to get off the ground. I know it's not necessarily cheap. It's cheaper than a lot of places. We actually discount it quite a bit because we work with so many pretty startups, and it just puts you on pretty solid footing. So consider it. That's my plug. That's all I'm going to do. Like I said, I'll stick around if anyone wants to talk about anything in particular. Thanks, guys.
You guys want to hang around and come around to everyone and like make sure I got you written down, so not for a bit.
Can I take this?
Yeah. Can you turn off the